Our last speaker of this session, this track, is named Anthony Frehner. Anthony is a front-end architect, and he's made many contributions to the CSS working group and the WHAT, WG. He's also a core team member of the Single SPA open source library for micro front-ends that some of you may have heard of. And he occasionally gives conference talks and writes technical articles. Please join me in welcoming Anthony to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for staying here and, attending this very last session. I know it's probably not the most exciting topic, but I'll try to keep you as awake as I can. One of the fun things about being the last speaker is that when you wake up, you put on your watch like activity tracker. And my watch has been thinking all day that I've been sprinting, just straight out sprinting. So I've filled my circles about 3 times right now, so it's pretty great. Just a quick introduction about myself. Anthony Frehner. I just do open source stuff, and probably the most important thing to know about me is that I'm the favorite child of my mother, and I'm also the favorite employee of my boss, and I also can be trusted 100% in everything that I say. So, totally, yeah. Cool. So, the reason why we're here is kind of just to get out of work and get some free lunch and leave the house for the first time in maybe 2 years or so. That's certainly me. Yeah, thank you. And I guess another couple reasons why I'm here personally is to kind of talk a little bit about the history API shortcomings and how a new proposal looks to kind of resolve some of those issues and hopefully maybe solicit some feedback in the end. So to get started, AppHistory is, like I mentioned, a proposal that kind of aims to replace the current history API. In other words, kind of the way of doing navigations and routing in single-page applications. And if you were to go to their URL, you'd be greeted with a giant wall of text. And it's great to have that wall of text, but it maybe is a little too dense for most of us, and it certainly was for me. It took me about 6 or 7 readings just to be able to understand it. So what I hope to do today is kind of distill that giant wall of text down into something a little more digestible for everyone, including myself. And in order to do that, I kind of want to talk about why AppHistory, this new proposal, is even needed. And it really comes down to history is good, and it's providing a lot of value for us right now, but it could be better. And some of the ways that it could be better, we'll talk about some of the ways that it could be better. So for example, one of the problems with the current history API is the integration with your standard beautiful declarative anchor tags. Like if you want a single page navigation off of this anchor tag, you can't just have that anchor tag. You actually have to write some JavaScript too. And that's not the best, but it's also not the worst, right? So for example, you have to add an event listener, a click event listener. And then you have to prevent default if someone were to click that link so that it doesn't turn into a multi-page application or multi-page navigation, but it stays as a single page navigation. Then you call history push state yourself. And there's actually some nuance in there as well, and I kind of just left a single comment, but you may not even know this, but a lot of people that maintain history APIs, like their own libraries for it, have to do checks for silly things like if a user was holding down the control button and then click the link, they don't actually want a single page navigation. They want a multi-page navigation in a new tab and things like that. So you have to check for all these different things. Not fun. And so that's one problem of the current history API. To kind of talk about the next problem, I thought we'd do a little bit of basic trivia, and I'll start off hopefully a little bit easy. So when you click a button, what sort of event can you get out of that? You can get a click event, yeah. Hopefully that one was pretty easy because I kind of gave it away in the last one. Let's try a little bit harder. When you change the URL hash, what sort of event can you get from that? Hash change, great, awesome. I'm loving the audience participation here. Cool. When you submit a form, what kind of event can you get from that? A submit event. Okay, those are pretty easy. I'm going to ramp up the difficulty just a tiny, tiny bit on this next one. Let's see if anyone can get it. I'm fairly confident in your abilities, though. When the drawing buffer associated with a WebGL rendering context object has been lost, what kind of event do you get from that? I like that. Undefined is not a function. Yeah, so sorry, maybe I went a little too hard on that. That's a WebGL context lost one. Sorry, my bad. Let me change up this next question then a little bit. Try something a little more English. If your friend commits to hang out with you this weekend, but then later cancels those plans, what kind of event do you get from that? Ooh, yeah, I like it. That's right, a promise rejection event, right? They committed to hanging out with you, but then they rejected it, so anyway. But kind of coming back now to history, when you call history.pushState, what kind of event do you get from that? And the answer is, you get nothing. And this is one of those gifs that I swear I can almost hear in my head, just him yelling at me personally. I'm sorry. But that's kind of crazy, right? One of the foundational APIs of the web that we use for single-page navigation doesn't have an event that anyone can subscribe or listen to. And that can cause some problems. One of the problems comes down to sharing. So as I mentioned before, a lot of people have created their own history API libraries to kind of work around some of these issues. But let's say I'm a developer that wants to make this widget or this component that is cross-framework, can be used anywhere, used in any library type thing. The problem I'm going to run into if I want to integrate with navigation or history or something like that is that each library has its own interface of accessing it and integrating with it and things like that. And so it kind of comes down to, well, the library's content, but I, as a third-party widget developer, I'm not really happy about this situation. So maybe what I can do is I can go talk to these different libraries, like the Vue router, the React router, the Svelte router, and say, hey, can you guys all figure something out so that my job is easier? And they're going to come back and look at me and be like, that's not great on our side either. It would make my life easier, but for them, that's not something they're looking forward to. So it kind of comes down to sharing issues. Like, there's no standard way to share this information across different libraries, things like that. And then finally, one of the last issues that I want to touch upon here with history is that there's no way of accessing the history stack. And one way to think of the history stack, if you're not familiar with it, I'm going to come over here. Let's see how this is. If you hold down on the back button, you can kind of, as a user, visually see all of the different URLs that you've been to, which is really nice and cool as a user. But as a developer, you actually don't have access to that history stack at all. And so that kind of comes back to another reason why people have created their own history libraries, is so that they can keep track of that stack and say, well, 3 navigations ago, you were on this URL, and you had this state, and stuff like that. But as a developer, there is no standard way to share that information again. And it kind of comes back to this whole situation where, okay, now we have to figure out how does Vue router integrate with or share information with maybe a React router, or how do I, as a third-party developer, work with all of those libraries? So, with some of those issues laid out, let me introduce AppHistory. And I like to think of it as the foundation of Web 4.0. We're trying to get ahead of the curve now, so it's really important to learn these things, but I actually don't understand this whole Web 3.0 stuff, so if someone wants to explain that to me at some point, that'd be cool. So if you remember, one of the first issue that we talked about with the current history API is that you have to use some JavaScript in order to integrate with an anchor tag. And fortunately, the solution for that through AppHistory is that you just use an anchor tag. There's no JavaScript required. In other words, if someone clicks on an anchor tag, it will automatically, once a browser implements it, it will automatically go through the AppHistory API. And so now you can use these beautiful declarative HTML tags that we all know and love. The other nice side effect from this, though, is that if your user has JavaScript disabled, or if your JavaScript hasn't loaded yet, this still works. That's just a normal anchor tag, and it'll just do a full page, like a multi-page navigation. And so it's a great fallback for if things aren't working on your app. Awesome. The next issue that we talked about was the sharing issues, about how libraries can interop, or me as a developer can figure out a way to get my widget to work with all libraries. But if we really think about it, it came down to the fact that there was no standard API or event that anyone could listen to. And so again, the solution to that is pretty simple. AppHistory will now introduce, once it's implemented, if it's implemented, will now introduce a single event that anyone can listen to and be notified of when a navigation starts. The navigation event itself has some cool methods and properties on it that we'll talk about in a minute, but that's the high-level overview of, like, hey, this now just works for anybody. Anyone can add an event listener. That's great. Oops, yeah, there we go. And then the final issue that we talked about was that the history stack was hidden from us. And again, the solution is pretty simple. AppHistory will allow you to gain access to the history stack, as well as information about, what the URL is, what the state was for each entry and stuff like that. It also avoids some of the issues that you may not have been aware that the history stack currently has, such as if you had an iframe on your web page and that iframe navigated, that would show up in the history stack as well. But as an application developer, most of the time I don't really care about an iframe navigation. I only really care about my navigations and stuff. So the app history won't include iframe navigations or things like that. Awesome. Cool. So those are some of the ways that app history is looking to kind of smooth over the rough edges of the current history API. But wait, there's more. And these are some of the features that you can get. And some of the things that I hadn't even really thought of, but it's nice because when you design a new API from the ground up, you can do some pretty cool stuff with it. So the first thing I want to talk about is I mentioned that the history event object itself has some cool methods and properties on it. The one that we're going to focus on is called transition while. And what this API does, or what this method does, is you pass a promise to it. And if you pass a promise to that transition while method, it does several things. The first thing it does is it tells the browser, it gives a clear signal to the browser that I want this navigation to be a single page navigation. The second thing that it does is it tells the browser, I don't want this navigation to be considered complete until that promise resolves, which is really great for, like, if you need data on a specific URL, you pass like a fetch promise to transition while, and the browser will not signal that that navigation is complete until that promise resolves. And then your promise is already, or your data is already there once you render that URL. So it's pretty cool like that. A side effect of that, coming back to here, is if the browser knows how long a navigation is taking and when a navigation started and when it ended because you passed a promise to it, that enables you to get essentially the same interaction or the same interface from a browser as a multi-page navigation. So in other words, app history is going to signal to browsers, hey, you will now know what a single page navigation looks like, and single page navigations can get the same interface changes, such as the loading state up here and the refresh button changing to an X and stuff like that. Those will all just hopefully come natively to your single page navigations, which is something that you absolutely cannot do right now with the current history API. So that's pretty cool too. Other wins that come from this is that it can clearly signal to assistive technologies that a navigation has started and how long it's taking and when it's done. Also things that are really hard to do. So that's pretty cool. One final thing I want to point out, and there's a lot more to be talked about, but this is the last one I'll talk about as part of the navigate event, is that there is a property on it called .signal. And signal is an abort signal. And if you're not familiar with an abort signal, all it really is a standardized way to signal that an event has been canceled or stopped. And so the event, the history event or the navigate event comes with a signal already as part of it. And the cool thing is that a lot of DOM APIs already accept abort signals natively. So for example, if I pass a fetch call to transition while, fetch takes in abort signal. And if that navigation gets canceled for whatever reason, whether the user pushes X or whether I cancel it myself or something like that, fetch automatically understands that and will cancel that promise for you. And it won't go into the .then. It's pretty cool stuff. It also allows you to do your own cancellation logic as well. It has its own, an abort signal has its own event listeners that you can listen to and provide your own logic to. So that's pretty cool stuff. So like I said, there's quite a bit more to discover about AppHistory, but I wanted to keep it fairly high level, and I wanted to keep it pretty simple. But this is the main stuff. And finally, I hope that one of my hopes coming from this is that I also kind of want to invite you all to, if you're interested, to get involved. And one thing I want to be clear is that to get involved with standards or specs doesn't mean writing code a lot of the time. What it can mean is just taking the time to read about it and try to understand it. And more importantly, it can also mean to just ask questions about it and say, hey, I have a use case for this. Does it solve my use case or my problem? And that really helps the people that are making new proposals or new standards to think about your use case and think about, well, does it or do we need to change it in some way? So the AppHistory proposal is not finalized yet. And this means that there's still a lot of opportunity to say, for someone to get involved and say, well, I'm really curious about this issue or this thing. Does it solve this? If you're nervous about getting involved or anything like that, feel free to come talk to me or someone else who's much more knowledgeable and pleasant to be around. But feel free to come talk to me if you want to get kind of like an introduction or things like that. I'd love to help you out. But that's pretty much it. Thank you again for staying for the final talk, and everyone have a good day.